World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, kicking off a new season with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Our returning panel of Roundup regulars will be looking at Pakistan, post-Pervez. Following the resignation of Pervez Mussharaf, the bare-knuckled contest for Pakistan's presidency has left the husband of assassinated leader Benazir Bhutto on top. Once jailed on corruption charges, where will the man detractors call Mr. 10% take this precarious U.S. ally? A no-show in Pyongyang, as the North Korean government celebrated the nation's 60th anniversary with the usual military pomp. Self-styled dear leader Kim Jong-il was conspicuous by his absence. As health rumors with official denial swirl, policymakers are contemplating a Korea without Kim. Tbilisi postmortem. Russia vows to keep over 7,000 troops in the breakaway regions of Georgia, while a visiting Dick Cheney described, quote, a deep and abiding U.S. interest, unquote, in keeping the nation free of Russian domination. What was the recent conflict about, and what will be its impact going forward? Assessing the surge. Citing growing Iraqi military competence, George Bush announced plans to withdraw 8,000 U.S. troops by February. Meanwhile, the effect of the surge has become a hot topic in the presidential campaign. Is the announced redeployment just window dressing, or is the administration's endgame in Iraq paying off? Rested and ready to grapple with these issues and more, we're pleased to welcome back John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back. And I suppose we'll have a particularly energetic roundup because you guys are all rested up after your summer's off. So I want to dig in on Pakistan, and John, maybe we'll start with you on this. And so we have now Ali al-Zardari in as president, coming on the heels of a tumultuous time. Mussharaf is pushed out. There are elections. Benazir Bhutto is assassinated. Is Zardari the person finally to bring some stability to Pakistan?
I don't think so. Robert Kaplan, a number of years ago, gave a lecture at one of the institutes in Washington where he described Pakistan as one of those countries where the rural illiterate, the have-nots were growing in numbers and importance, and the urban elite was shrinking. And Zardari represents that urban elite. On the other hand, Mussharaf had very little control over the Northwest Territories either, and the military has problems within their own ranks as to their own position vis-a-vis the insurgents there, as well as to the tribes. So I say that this is becoming increasingly more complicated, and that the U.S. seems to be moving in the direction of more direct action. That whether or not we have received explicit or implicit approval of the Pakistanis, we mean to cross that border to take the pressure off of our actions in Afghanistan.
Well, and this is a real, I would assume, a very important test case for Zardari as president is with the U.S. now, recent stories coming out that President Bush has authorized military incursions into Pakistan on the Afghan-Pakistan border, which is an issue which is very important for Zardari domestically because a lot of his population sees this as a huge affront to national sovereignty. You've got the military, as John's saying, kind of, we're not really sure, are they for this or against this? How do you see Zardari dealing with this issue?
Well, I think he's caught between a rock and a hard place in a way, because first of all, he has very weak support in his coalition. He doesn't have a huge backing, in the legislature that chose him. So he starts out from a weak position. The military has, in press conferences recently when it became clear that the United States was conducting these raids, and the new part here is that they're explicitly doing them without asking the Pakistanis. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but that's the way the story is being told publicly. And he was being pushed in a press conference where they were saying, aren't the Americans terrorists? Aren't the American terrorists? And part of his support, well, a large part of his support will depend on whether or not he can be seen as, not as the same kind of lapdog that Mussharaf was seen as. So, and then you have the military, again, publicly saying that they will not let the United States go into their sovereign territory without permission. So he's really caught here in a very difficult position. I don't think he has the strength of character and the support among the people to really pull this off. But he's going to have to try. I mean,
well,
that's
just picking up on that, as we mentioned in the intro, he was known as Mr. 10%. For many, after Bhutto his wife was assassinated, he was kind of more in the shadows, where his public image was one that people thought was not going to be enough to lead the party. So how does he become president?
I mean, this is like Billy Carter in a way. I mean, he was kept in the shadows deliberately before, and then people were surprised that he was able to actually take control of the largest party and become president. And he made sure he maintained the presidential powers that Mussharaf had built up, and also kind of double-crossed Sharif, the former prime minister, who's the most popular politician, and didn't reappoint the Supreme Court justices that had been sacked. And so he's tried to grab power, but his political situation is extremely tenuous. He's not, he has in the opposition the most popular politician in the country, and he's publicly siding with the United States in expanded military efforts and incursions into Pakistan, which is not publicly popular. So as Ann pointed out, the coalition is fragile. He seems like he's in a very precarious situation. It's hard to know where the military is on this, but it still seems like a precarious situation. But he's positioned himself as pro, quote-unquote, war on terror, and trying to position himself, I think, to get a lot of economic aid from the United States as well as military aid to assuage the military. So that's the politics, a patronage kind of setup. But he's very much tied to Bush's foreign policy right now, which is an extremely unpopular place to be, and likely will lead to more problems down the road if there are more, civilian casualties. And President Bush announcing that there are always collateral damage this week in any war is, I'm sure, not helpful within Pakistan either.
Robert points to a very interesting and important factor, that is the economics. They are beholden to the development aid as well as to the military aid that we give, and therefore they're going to, whatever they say is going to be put into that context.
Well, I mean, it may be easy to look at Ali al-Zardari and say, boy, does he have a problem, but it is a problem for the United States if there is another tumultuous political transition in Pakistan, is it not? Yeah.
Yes, it's a huge problem. They need to keep him in power as long as they can. But it's also a larger problem. These incursions that are taking place are really, Robert talked about the civilian casualties. This is playing really big in Pakistan. And if there are more civilian casualties, this puts the whole relationship, I read it was called a brittle alliance. Well, it's really very, very brittle. It's about to break because the United States going in, and I know that there are reasons why we believe we have to do this, because nobody's controlling that territory, and it's critical on the war on terror. But all you need is a few more incidents of killings of civilians, and by one account, the civilians are all fleeing. So this could actually not turn out to be such a good thing for us, because it could end up being more of a safe haven for the terrorist group. So we don't really know how that's going to turn out. I
want to shift us on to another, from one leader that who's starting the beginning of their political time on the top, to one who may be near the end of his political time on top, which is Kim Jong-il. And what if he has had a stroke, if he is seriously ill? What does this potentially mean for say, North Korea, but also for the region and the United States?
Well, it's hard to say, because he is one of the more reclusive leaders of the world. Also, we keep wondering what the world's going to be like without Kim Jong-il and Fidel. And we'll need to find some new leaders like that. But, but it's hard to say because, I mean, obviously the real concern here is the nuclear card, but there's also regional stability. There have been refugees that have gone over the border. If there is great instability with a change in leadership, there's the nuclear question, there's the economic development of Korea, there's the possibility of refugee flows. There's a possibility of, there's a split in the military, and a lot of people think that there could be a military government between those who want to sort of push for more modernization, more privatization, and those who are hardcore economic nationalists and who would like to sort of take the country even a little bit farther backward than it is right now. And you have the children of the leader, none of whom have been bred for this position, but who will play a role in the succession, and the Communist Party itself. So there are various factions or participants that will come to the fore here, and nobody really knows because nobody is really sure about what's going on there. So they look for these odd signs, just like criminologists used to, sort of look to see who was sitting next to whom and how close they were, and to the right or to the left, kind of thing. So it's very interesting, but I think that probably it won't make a huge amount of difference. I think that the one thing that Korea has been doing very successfully for quite some time now is playing its nuclear card. It agrees to certain deals so that it can get what it wants in terms of energy needs and economic aid, and then it pulls back, because if it really abandons its nuclear program, it has nothing. It has no cards left to play with. And it can continue to do that whether the military is in power or whether Kim Jong-il hangs on for a little bit longer.
Is it time for the U.S. to be thinking seriously about a post-Kim North Korea?
Well, it certainly looks like it, given that apparently it's very unusual for him not to be at the 60th anniversary kind of a military event. This is like a marquee event for him or his father. It's hard to say what preparation for that would mean, because no one really knows who supports what within the ruling group and the various balances of power. I mean, there's a theory that the military is wanting to pull back on the nuclear deal and that Kim was the one pushing it, but some people think that's not the case at all, and that it's all consistent with Kim's position. It's probably the kind of situation where it'll just have to sort itself out. It's hard to prepare in advance. It looks like the nuclear deal, which was going to be one of the quote-unquote accomplishments of the Bush administration, has already been falling apart since August. Whether that's related to Kim's illness or not, nobody knows. And so we should be prepared, but it's still going to have to be a rapid response to whatever develops, whether it's one of his children who takes power, whether it becomes military power, or whether there's a period of instability. I think Anne's right. The instability is the biggest possible concern right now, particularly with nuclear weapons being on the scene.
So about a minute before the break, John. So yeah, how do we deal with this from a foreign policy?
I think we need to be a little cautious in terms of how we read this. All of our information is coming out of South Korean intelligence, and the South Koreans are not without their own interest in this process. So we may know more in the weeks ahead. And you have to remember, the North Koreans call this a conspiracy plot on the part of the outside world, pushing these stories about the fact that he's ill. I think the instability is the one that will concern the South Koreans and the Chinese most of all.
Well, I imagine that China again is potentially the most immediately impacted if there is a crisis. Right. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment here in International Focus to talk about our next two stories. We'll see you in a moment.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. We're here with John Katzka, Ann Hamilton, and Robert Kraig. Robert, I wanted to start with you on our next story, which is to kind of do a bit of a post-mortem on the Russian incursion into Georgia and the violence that ensued in the current situation. And as a student of foreign policy, if you're writing your next book in a few years and you have a chapter on this, is the story going to be the Russian invasion of Georgia was like reminiscent of what the Soviets did in quashing democracies in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia? Or is it more like what the United States and NATO did in bombing Serbia to protect Bosnia and Kosovo in the Balkans? Which way is that story going to come out?
Yeah, I don't think it's either of those polls that's going to come out as. I mean, it'll come out as a huge miscalculation on the part of Georgia's leadership, that they thought they were about to get into NATO and that somehow NATO would protect them, which is, from a military standpoint, just a balance of power standpoint, not reasonable. There certainly is an issue with the breakaway provinces actually being opposed to the government of Georgia. Georgia being an incredibly poor country. I mean, the economic situation there is unbelievably bad. So the Russians have plenty of fig leaves to put up about the local leaders in those areas wanting to be part of Russia, not wanting to be part of Georgia. And there's just, I think it's really, I like the analogy to Russia going from a Soviet foreign policy to a 19th century kind of nationalist foreign policy, and they're simply defining their sphere of influence. And they don't like NATO coming right up to their border. They don't want Georgia in. They don't want Ukraine in. And so they're asserting themselves, and the Georgian government gave them a perfect opportunity to do so, because they went in and certainly were challenging Russia's authority and affecting Russian allies and actual ethnic Russians. And so there's been a lot of saber rattling, say among neocons in the United States, that we should militarize, we should go after the Russian bear like it was deterring World War III during the Cold War, and it's just silly because it's not going to happen, regardless of whether people think it should happen. I mean, we're talking about moving our Iraqi forces into Afghanistan right now, and Europe has no stomach for conflict. So it's regrettable for Georgia as a nation state, but neither of the great powers are going to do anything about it per se, and it's within Russia's ability to do, and they've decided to do it.
Well, John, if you go the other way and you don't do what the neocons are saying in terms of a strong military response.
This isn't just the neocons.
Are we opening up a potential domino effect where it's Belarus or Ukraine next?
That's hard to see, but I would say that this is the campaign season, and therefore most candidates are trying to outdo each other and talking tough about what Russia should be or not be doing. Russia had a wonderful opportunity. I was just at a reunion of old Soviet hands who had served in the Russian embassy and the American embassy in Moscow in 1977 when we had the big fire. And I talked with about 50 or 60 people who were there. We had a big embassy. And universally, we thought that the Georgians just did one of the most stupid things they could possibly have ever have done, of going into Southeast Asia. That said, we need to lay down some markers to the Russians on this. They very quickly, we now have a new doctrine. It's called the Medvedev doctrine. And the first three are the usual. We respect international law. We want a multipolar world. Russia is not seeking to control or take over anyone. But then they get into the important points. Russians anywhere are a matter of concern to Moscow. And they are also defining areas where they have special interests, not dissimilar from our own mineral doctrine. They're saying those countries along our periphery who were formerly part of the Soviet Union, and actually those were most of those countries were also part of Russia, are part of our interest area. And they also have identified Eastern Europe and the Middle East as possible areas of interest. So we're seeing a new foreign policy.
So, Anna, I mean, if you're looking at this as a trend, I mean, the Russians skillfully handed out Russian passports to the Ossetians and the Abkhaz so that they could bolster their claim that they were protecting Russians. Is that a sign of things to come? I mean, is it a sign that they're gonna be more assertive in whatever form it may be, politically, even economically, as well as militarily, in the border areas, or is this more of an isolated Russian slapdown of Georgia because they had been really provoking and sticking their thumb in Russia's eye for a period of years?
I think Russia will take every opportunity it can to assert itself, and it was given this opportunity on a silver platter. The Russians have long been licking their wounds. Putin talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. They've been looking for ways to reassert themselves. And so a specific answer to that question, if they're given the opportunity, yes. I don't think that they're going to go out on any sort of adventurous, really adventurous foreign policy and start invading every country where they think they might be able to win. But they will take advantage of opportunities, particularly in this area that they call the near abroad. And I think that, our election campaign, while we can say, oh, it's just our election campaign, does appear like a great provocation to them when you have people saying, I am a Georgian, evoking John Kennedy with I'm a Berliner, and bringing NATO right up to their backyard. It's not just their backyard, it's their back door. And the mission of NATO has never really been redefined since it was, since the end of the Cold War. So from a Russian perspective, you can see it as a provocation on the part of the United States. Even after all of this, during the Republican convention, Vice President Cheney was over there talking about, yes, you should be in NATO.
I guess this kind of comes back, Robert, to the point you were making earlier. I mean, to what extent, it's a way of the difference between looking at this episode as being the start of a more aggressive Russian foreign policy versus a response to whether it's NATO expansion or the situation in Kosovo.
I mean, yeah, I think that they're a defensive power. They're not an imperialist power. I guess they're defensive enough, and their psychology is shaken enough, as Anne was pointing out, that if we over-provoke them, if we treat this like they're an imperialist power, that could provoke all sorts of problems down the road. And so we cannot be dealing with them as if they're Stalin's Soviet Union, and we just shouldn't be, and it will not be our interest to do so or NATO's interest to do so.
I agree. I think short term, I see them as being defensive in terms of their interest. But we do need to lay markers down in terms of where we stand on some of these things, because longer term, as they have $600 billion in revenue in their treasury, which gives them an enormous amount of flexibility in terms of what they want to do.
Right. We've got just a few minutes left, but another big story to go before we get to some of the issues you all want to talk about, which is the surge. And so this is going to become a big issue in the campaign season. So what is the story here? I mean, some people are making hay about, oh, were you right about the surge or were you wrong about the surge? Is the surge successful or not successful? Where does that leave us from a policy standpoint going forward? I mean, is mission accomplished, Robert?
I don't think so. I think this is the equivalent of like tripling the police force in Milwaukee temporarily, which you couldn't afford long term, and reducing crime rate, but not having done anything underlying to get at the causes of crime. And so as soon as we pull out, ultimately, you still don't have a functioning nation state, ultimately. And so there's going to be instability. I mean, President Bush wants to say that we've taken out Al-Qaeda out of some of Iraq. Of course, we brought them in by invading in the first place. So, and violence levels are down to 204 levels. That means that they're not up to what they were during the height, but they're still, it's certainly not, a stable country with a stable civil society at this point. And so this rhetoric about the surge has brought peace and we've won the war is way off base, I think. And then all of the talk is moving the forces into Afghanistan and Pakistan, which we talked about earlier.
I mean, I agree. I think that there was no doubt that we had to bring the violence down, and that violence has come down, and that's a good thing. There's also have been some positive developments in some of the Sunnis, especially, who were supporting Al-Qaeda before coming around and working with the United States. The future, though, politically doesn't look all that strong, in the sense that the major divisions are still there.
I disagree. I think that if you only tie what we did there to the number of troops we added, you miss the point. Because the point was to change the whole strategy in which we dealt with Iraq, and it was taking the troops out of their protected barracks and moving them out into the neighborhoods that became critical to getting the Sunnis to buy in, to give them a level of protection. So I also think that the drawdown of troops in Iraq is very much related to what we're trying to do in Afghanistan.
John, I'm wondering if we can keep with you and segue into now, what are some stories that we've missed and have been important, or we should be looking for going forward?
Well, my first assignment in Thailand has been in the news a bit. There have been riots there, and it's basically a power struggle over the former prime minister. Again, we talked about Mr. 10%. Well, this was probably Mr. 30%, Thaksin Shinawatra, who won't even come back to Thailand because he's afraid of going to jail.
Ann?
I found an interesting report about, put out by an Israeli human rights group about the security zones that the Israelis are claiming around the settlements near the wall that they're building. And I think that we've sort of taken our focus while we're looking at Pakistan and Iraq and Iran, sort of forgetting that what a lot of people consider to be the root of all this conflict is still going on.
Robert?
I think this is related to the surge story. I think that Iraq is a much lower level issue in the presidential campaign than anyone anticipated, and will continue to be so unless there's some sort of major incident, because even conservatives think that we need to get out of there and that we shouldn't have gone in there. So there's this consensus, bipartisan consensus on that, and it's not a consensus necessarily to go to Afghanistan, which relates back. It's a consensus to actually invest in this country. And so that you will see, if there isn't a major foreign policy incident, it may not be a major factor in the presidential election.
So I can't give John a chance to respond here. Robert Kraig, Ann Hamilton, John Katzka, certainly you didn't lose your touch over the summer. Thank you very much. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,